I always thought I had it all figured out. A thriving business, a beautiful wife, and 2 kids who made everything worth it. Life wasn't perfect, but whose is? It worked. Or at least, I thought it did. That was until I found out about him, Greg. I'm Elliot, 42, and I run a company that I built from the ground up. It's not some massive corporation, but it's my baby, and it's successful enough to catch the attention of people like Dan Baronsky. Baronsky's the kind of guy who will smile in your face while plotting how to take you down. I've dealt with guys like him before. You learn to keep your distance, be smart, and never show weakness. But Baronsky played a different game this time. He didn't come after my company with a hostile takeover or a lawsuit. No, he used my wife, Tracy. I found out about her affair in the worst way possible. It wasn't rumors or gossip, nothing like that. One morning, an anonymous package showed up at my office. No note, no explanation, just a flash drive. Thinking it was business-related, I plugged it into my computer. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. There she was, my wife, with him. In our bedroom. The video showed more than I ever wanted to know. It wasn't just a single video either. There were months' worth of footage, different times, different places. Greg, the guy in the video, wasn't just some random fling. He was someone planted by Baronsky, a part of his plan to break me. Tracy didn't even know she was being filmed. I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I slammed the laptop shut. My mind was spinning. I couldn't breathe. I kept asking myself, how long has this been going on? I stared at the screen, hoping that somehow it was all fake. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. What made it worse? The next video file that popped up on the screen wasn't of Tracy and Greg. It was of Baronsky himself, smirking at the camera, practically oozing arrogance. He laid it all out, how he set Greg up, how he had the videos, and how he could ruin everything if I didn't sell him my company for next to nothing. My life had just exploded, and he was there, holding the detonator. I sat there in my office, staring at that smirk on Baronsky's face, my blood boiling. He thought he had me. He thought I'd crumble and hand over everything I worked for just to keep my family intact. Tracy's face kept flashing in my mind, and with every image, the betrayal cut deeper. But I wasn't going to let him win. Not like this. I took a deep breath and started thinking. The videos were a powerful weapon, sure, but they didn't mean I was powerless. I wasn't going to give in, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let Tracy keep lying to my face every day like nothing was wrong. That night, I didn't say a word about what I knew. I watched her like a hawk, though. It was surreal, Tracy laughing, talking about her day like nothing had changed. I almost admired her ability to lie so easily. Almost. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I needed to stay calm and think about what came next. The next day, after work, I made the decision. I walked into our bedroom where Tracy was getting ready for bed. She looked up, smiling like always. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, completely oblivious. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, staring at her, trying to figure out how to start. It wasn't going to be pretty. Finally, I just blurted it out. "I know." Tracy frowned, confused. "Know what?" I felt my fists clenching. "About you. And Greg." Her face went pale instantly, and she stumbled over her words. What are you talking about?" I pulled out my phone and played one of the videos. Just a few seconds of it. It was enough. Tracy's eyes widened, and she gasped, putting her hand over her mouth. "Oh my God, where did you get that?" "That's what you're worried about?" "Where I got the video." I couldn't believe it. I threw my phone on the bed and took a step closer, my voice low but angry. "How long, Tracy? How long have you been screwing him?" She shook her head, tears already welling up in her eyes. "Elliot, it wasn't like that. It wasn't serious. It meant nothing." I scoffed. "Nothing? You call months of sneaking around with this guy nothing?" "Jesus, Tracy, how could you do this? To me? To us?" She started crying then, full-on sobs. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to happen. It just got out of control. I wasn't buying it." "Out of control?" "No, you made choices. You let it happen. Over and over. And don't even try to act like you're the victim here." She wiped her face, trying to regain some control. "I never loved him, Elliot. It was a mistake. I never wanted to hurt you. Please, we can fix this. Her words hung in the air. Fix this? There was no fixing this. I stared at her, feeling disgusted, feeling hurt, but also feeling numb. We're done, Tracy. Tracy collapsed onto the bed, her tears streaming down her face, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. I was done being the fool. We can't be done, Elliot. Please, it was a mistake, she begged, her voice shaking. I crossed my arms, staring at her with cold eyes. A mistake is one time, Tracy. This was months of sneaking around behind my back. Do you even understand what you've done? She tried to reach for me, but I stepped back. I couldn't stand to be near her. I didn't mean for this to happen. He was just there. It was a weak moment. I love you, Elliot, not him. I laughed bitterly. Love? Don't talk to me about love right now, Tracy. You've been cheating on me with some guy who was hired by Baranski, of all people, to ruin me. Did you know that? He was paid to screw you. Her face twisted in confusion. What are you talking about? What do you mean he was hired? Of course, she didn't know that part. Greg had played her just as much as he'd played me. Baranski hired him, Tracy. This wasn't just some random affair. You were part of a setup to destroy my business, and you walked right into it. She stared at me, her expression shifting from shock to disbelief. No, that can't be true. Greg would never, he's not like that. I shook my head. You really don't get it, do you? You think this guy cares about you? He was using you the whole time. And now Baranski's trying to blackmail me with the videos. So congratulations, Tracy, you've not only wrecked our marriage, you've helped my biggest rival try to destroy everything I've worked for. She started shaking her head, repeating no over and over like it would somehow change the truth. But the truth was out there, and there was no going back. I can't believe this, she whispered, tears pouring down her face again. Elliot, I swear I didn't know. I thought it was just a stupid affair. I never wanted to hurt you like this. I swear. I clenched my jaw, barely holding back my anger. Well, you did. And now you'll have to live with that. She reached out again, her voice trembling. Please, don't throw everything away. We can fix this. We can go to therapy, talk to someone, anything. Just don't leave me. It almost would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. Therapy? After all of this? I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but I was done being reasonable. I'm filing for divorce, Tracy. There's nothing left to save. The words hit her like a slap, and she broke down completely. No, Elliot, please. Think about the kids. What will they think? You can't just walk away from us like this. I glared at her. You did this. Not me. You ruined this family when you decided to cheat. So don't put that on me. She kept sobbing, begging me to reconsider, but it was over. There was no way I was going to stay married to someone who'd betrayed me like this. The trust was shattered, and once it's broken, there's no putting it back together. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her crying on the bed. My mind was already racing to the next step. I had to deal with Baranski. I had to get my kids through this. But one thing was clear, I was done with Tracy. There was no turning back now. After I left the bedroom, the house felt like a ghost town. Tracy stayed in there, crying herself into a mess, but I wasn't about to comfort her. I went straight to my office, slamming the door behind me. I sat there, staring at the wall, my mind racing. Divorce wasn't going to be easy, but I had no choice. I had to protect myself, my kids, and everything I'd worked for. A few days later, I met with a lawyer and got the ball rolling on the divorce papers. I wasn't sure how Tracy would react, but I didn't care at that point. I just needed to get out before Baranski's blackmail scheme went any further. I figured if I could sell the company to someone else, someone Baranski couldn't touch, I could cut him off at the knees. But things got worse before they got better. A week after that confrontation with Tracy, the videos leaked. Baranski, or someone working for him, had made sure they ended up online. They spread like wildfire, first on shady websites, then all over social media. It was a nightmare. Everyone saw them, our friends, our family, even people at the kids' school. I couldn't escape the humiliation. I remember sitting in the kitchen when my phone started blowing up. Texts, missed calls, notifications. Everyone I knew was either asking if I'd seen it or sending me links. My heart dropped when I realized what was happening. I'd expected Boronsky to use the videos as leverage, but I didn't think he'd actually release them. I rushed to find Tracy. She was in the living room, her face pale as she stared at her phone. She knew. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with horror. "Elliot, everyone's seen it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, feeling a strange numbness wash over me. "Yeah, I know." She started crying again, covering her face with her hands. "What are we going to do? How am I going to face anyone?" I didn't have an answer for her. Honestly, I didn't care about her reputation at that moment. She'd made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. But I couldn't help but think about the kids. They'd hear about it sooner or later. How was I supposed to explain this to them? The next few days were brutal. Tracy became a social pariah. Friends, family, they all turned their backs on her. No one wanted to be associated with someone whose private life had been plastered all over the internet. She couldn't even show her face in public without whispers and judgment following her everywhere. It was hard to feel sympathy for her, though. She'd brought this on herself. But still, watching her break down again and again was unsettling. I had loved this woman once. We'd built a life together, a family. And now, because of her choices, and Boronsky's sick manipulation, everything was falling apart. Meanwhile, I stayed focused on my plan. Boronsky thought he had me in a corner, but I wasn't about to fold. I wasn't going to let him blackmail me into giving up my company. So, I found another buyer. A competitor of his, actually, who was eager to strike a deal. The moment the papers were signed, I'd be free of Boronsky's grip. He could keep his videos and his threats. They meant nothing once the company was out of my hands. But I wasn't free yet. First, I had to deal with the fallout of the leaked videos. And that was going to be the hardest part. The next few weeks were absolute hell. Every day the videos spread further, reaching people I never thought would see them. Business associates, old friends, even distant relatives. Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of their stares, the whispers following me like a shadow. And Tracy, she couldn't leave the house. Every time she stepped outside, she was met with judgmental looks, and she couldn't handle it. But in a way, I guess that was her problem now. The only thing I cared about was the kids. I tried to shield them from the mess, but kids hear things. They always do. It wasn't long before they came home from school, asking questions. "Dad, why are people saying bad stuff about Mom?" my daughter Emily asked one night at dinner. She was only 10, too young to understand everything, but old enough to know something was wrong. My son Kyle, 13, was quieter about it, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. He knew more than she did. I looked at them, struggling to find the words. "Some people are saying things because your mom and I are going through a hard time right now. But I don't want you worrying about that, okay? We're going to figure it out." Emily nodded, but I could tell she wasn't satisfied. Kyle just stared at his plate, not saying a word. I knew I couldn't keep them in the dark forever, but for now, I just wanted them to feel safe. Tracy, on the other hand, had become almost unrecognizable. She stopped fighting me about the divorce. After the videos leaked, she knew her reputation was shot. Friends who used to stand by her were gone, and her own family barely wanted to talk to her. The humiliation was too much for her to bear, and honestly, I didn't feel sorry for her anymore. One night, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her makeup was smeared, and she had this desperate look in her eyes. "I didn't know Elliot," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know Greg was working for Boronsky. If I had known." I cut her off. "It doesn't matter, Tracy. You still cheated. You made your choices, and now we're both paying for them. But I'm not going to let this destroy me." She wiped her eyes, trying to hold back more tears. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't want to lose everything." "Well, you did," I said coldly. "Now we've got to figure out how to move forward." A few days later, the divorce papers were finalized. There was no big fight over assets. Tracy knew she was in no position to demand anything. I kept the house, and she moved into a small apartment across town. We agreed on joint custody for the kids, though I could tell they didn't want to stay with her much. They were confused and hurt by everything, and Tracy wasn't exactly a comforting presence anymore. But I still had unfinished business with Boronsky. I wasn't about to let him get away with everything he'd done. He thought he was untouchable, that he could ruin my life and walk away with a smirk. But I had other plans. I called up a few contacts, guys who knew how to dig deep. Turns out, Boronsky wasn't as clean as he pretended to be. There were whispers about shady deals, hidden accounts, and business partners who'd disappeared after crossing him. I gathered everything I could, determined to expose him. And then one night, I got the call. "We've got something," my contact said. "Enough to ruin him." I hung up the phone, a sense of satisfaction settling in. Boronsky had used my wife to try and break me. Now, I had the means to destroy him. I met with my contact the next day, a guy named Marcus who specialized in digging up dirt on people like Boronsky. We met in a small diner on the outskirts of town, where no one would think to look for us. He slid a folder across the table, and I opened it, my hands trembling slightly with anticipation. "Everything you need is in there," Marcus said, leaning back in his seat. "Offshore accounts, tax evasion, a few shell companies used to launder money. Boronsky's been sloppy." I flipped through the documents, feeling a surge of satisfaction. Boronsky thought he could take everything from me by using Tracy, but now I had him by the throat. He had crossed the line, and I was going to make sure he paid for it. "You sure about all this?" I asked, wanting to be certain. The last thing I needed was to make a move without solid ground to stand on. Marcus nodded. "It's airtight. This stuff would ruin him. You release it to the right people, and he's done. No coming back from it." I closed the folder and slid it back into my bag. I knew exactly what I was going to do. Boronsky might have started this war, but I was damn well going to finish it. The next morning, I made a few calls. By lunchtime, I had a meeting set up with a journalist from a major financial outlet who had been gunning for a big story on corruption in the corporate world. I knew this would be a goldmine for him. The meeting was quick. I handed over the folder, laid out the basics of the situation, and left the rest in his hands. "You'll want to move fast on this," I told him as I walked away, "before Boronsky catches wind." 2 days later, the article dropped. It was front-page news, plastered across every business outlet. "Scandal rocks business tycoon Dan Boronsky. Tax evasion, fraud and corruption allegations surface." I'll never forget the look on his face when the news broke. Boronsky went from king of the hill to a sinking ship in a matter of hours. His phone must have been blowing up with calls from lawyers and shareholders, trying to salvage what was left of his reputation. But there was no saving it. I made sure of that. Boronsky tried to fight back, of course. His PR team scrambled to put out statements, deny the allegations, and paint the whole thing as a smear campaign. But it didn't matter. The evidence was too strong. The authorities started digging into his finances, and it wasn't long before he found himself facing multiple investigations. It was poetic justice. He tried to blackmail me, use my wife's betrayal to force me into submission. Instead, I'd taken him down without losing a cent. The best part? The company I sold? It was thriving under new ownership, and there was nothing Boronsky could do to touch it anymore. Meanwhile, Tracy's life continued to spiral. The videos had destroyed her socially, and she couldn't show her face anywhere without people whispering behind her back. The kids were distant with her, spending most of their time with me, and she was stuck in that tiny apartment, trying to piece together what was left of her life. I won't lie, it felt good watching everything fall apart for the people who had tried to tear me down. Greg, the guy she cheated with? I hadn't forgotten about him, either. But before I could deal with him, life threw another curveball. Just as I was riding the high of watching Boronsky's empire crumble, I got a call that threw me off balance. It was from one of my business contacts, someone who'd been keeping tabs on Greg, the guy Tracy had been cheating with. "Elliot, you're gonna want to hear this," the guy said, his voice low like he was about to drop some serious news. "Greg got attacked last night. Badly." I didn't respond right away, trying to process what he was telling me. "Attacked?" My mind raced. "What do you mean, attacked?" I asked. "He's in the hospital. Apparently, some guys jumped him outside a bar. Beat him up pretty bad. No one knows who did it." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling as I tried to wrap my head around it. Greg, the guy who had been part of this whole mess, who had slept with my wife, was lying in a hospital bed, probably wondering if he'd ever walk straight again. There was a part of me that felt like this was karma at work. He'd gotten involved with the wrong people like Boronsky, and it came back to bite him. But another part of me, well, it was strange. I should have felt satisfied, right? The guy who'd helped tear apart my marriage was paying for his part in all of this. But instead I felt nothing. It was like I was watching it from a distance, detached. Maybe I'd already gotten my revenge by destroying Boronsky. Or maybe, after everything I'd been through, I was just numb. Later that day, I got more details. Greg had been walking to his car after drinking with a couple of friends when some guys approached him. No warning, no words exchanged, they just started beating him. Broken ribs, fractured jaw, a concussion. The whole deal. He was lucky someone called an ambulance before it got worse. Tracy found out, of course. I heard about it through mutual friends. She tried to visit him in the hospital, but apparently, Greg didn't want to see her. It made sense. Why would he? The guy had been hired to manipulate her, to seduce her, and now that everything had gone sideways, I'm sure he was blaming her just as much as she was blaming him. A few days after the attack, Tracy came over to pick up the kids. We hadn't talked much since the divorce, keeping everything as civil as possible for the sake of our children. But today she looked shaken, more than usual. "Did you hear about Greg?" she asked, her voice unsteady. I nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "Yeah, I heard." She bit her lip, looking down at the floor. Do you think someone did it because of what happened between us? The videos? All of this?" I shrugged, keeping my face neutral. "I don't know, Tracy. He got involved with Boronsky, and maybe someone wanted to send a message. It's not my problem anymore." She looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes again. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I don't know how everything got so out of control." I sighed, shaking my head. "You made your choices, Tracy. We both did. Now we're just dealing with the fallout." She didn't say anything after that, just wiped her eyes and went to get the kids. Part of me could see how much this whole mess was eating her alive, but I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. We were past that. I was focused on my kids, on rebuilding my life, and on making sure I never got dragged into something like this again. Greg's attack was all over the news for a few days, but after that, it died down. No one ever got caught, and it became just another story that faded into the background. But for me, it was a reminder that no matter how much damage had been done, the real players were still paying the price. After Greg's attack, things quieted down, at least for a while. I kept to myself, focused on my kids, and tried to put all the chaos behind me. Tracy stayed distant, trying to repair what was left of her life, but she wasn't really a part of mine anymore. We kept things simple for the sake of the kids, nothing more. But Boronsky? He wasn't so lucky. I had expected things to unravel for him, but even I couldn't have predicted how fast it would all come crashing down. The investigations into his shady business practices were moving quickly, and it seemed like every day, new allegations were surfacing. It wasn't just tax evasion anymore. There were whispers about bribery, money laundering, and even ties to organized crime. It was the kind of scandal that destroyed people, and Boronsky was right in the middle of it. One morning, I was drinking my coffee and scrolling through the news when the headline hit me like a freight train. Business tycoon Dan Boronsky involved in fatal car crash. Foul play suspected. I blinked, reading the words again. Boronsky was dead. I quickly clicked on the article, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of it. According to the report, Boronsky had been driving late at night when his car veered off the road and slammed into a tree. The crash killed him instantly. At first glance, it looked like a tragic accident, but investigators were already looking into the possibility of foul play. Given everything that had been happening with his company, no one was ruling out the idea that someone had wanted him gone. I sat back in my chair, letting it all sink in. Boronsky, the man who had tried to blackmail me, who had used my wife to destroy my business, was dead. And not just dead, he was taken out under suspicious circumstances. It was almost too poetic. The guy who had built his empire on lies and manipulation had been taken down by the very world he lived in. I couldn't say I felt bad for him. How could I? He'd gotten what was coming to him. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play here. Boronsky had made a lot of enemies over the years, and someone had decided to settle the score once and for all. Later that day, the news started to explode with more details. His car had been tampered with, brake lines cut. It wasn't an accident. Someone had planned this. The speculation ran wild. Was it a business rival? Someone he had crossed in the underworld? Maybe even someone from within his own company, trying to cover their tracks before the investigation brought them down with him. It was a circus, and the media ate it up. Every news outlet was covering the story, digging into Baranski's past, his business deals, and the long list of people who might have wanted him gone. It was like something out of a movie, a man who had everything, taken out in the dead of night by forces he couldn't control. I kept a close eye on the developments, not because I had any personal stake left in it, but because I needed to see how it all played out. Baranski's death wasn't going to change what had happened to me, but it felt like closure. The man who had tried to ruin me was gone, and with him, all the threats he had made. That night, I sat on my back porch, sipping a beer and watching the sun go down. I should have felt some kind of relief, right? Baranski was dead. Greg had been beaten down. Tracy's life was in ruins. All the people who had betrayed me were paying the price. But the truth is, I didn't feel triumphant. Just tired. I had won in a way, but the cost was high. My marriage was over, my trust shattered, and my kids had gone through hell because of it. I had my company, my kids, my life, but it wasn't the same anymore. Maybe that's the thing about revenge. You think it'll make you feel whole again, like it'll fix everything that's been broken. But in the end, all it does is leave you standing in the wreckage, wondering if it was worth it. As the last of the sunlight disappeared over the horizon, I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. The war was over. Baranski was gone. Tracy was out of my life. But it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt like the end of something I hadn't wanted to start in the first place. With Baranski gone, the storm started to settle, but life didn't magically go back to normal. I had the freedom I fought for, no more threats, no more blackmail, but the damage had already been done. The divorce was final. My reputation had taken a hit with those who knew about the leaked videos, and Tracy was barely holding herself together. But I had the kids, and that's what mattered most to me. They were my focus now, the reason I pushed forward even when everything felt like it was crumbling. I wasn't about to let them suffer more than they already had. A week after Baranski's death, I took Kyle and Emily out for ice cream. It was a small attempt to get things back to normal, to give them a sense that everything was okay, even though we all knew it wasn't. They were quiet during the drive, and I could tell something was weighing on their minds. As we sat down at a small table with our ice cream, Kyle finally spoke up. "Dad, are things going to be okay now?" He looked up at me, his eyes filled with worry. He was only 13, but he had seen and heard more than any kid his age should have. I sighed, trying to find the right words. "Yeah, buddy, things are going to be okay. It's been tough, but we're getting through it. We'll be fine." Emily, sitting next to him, spoke up softly. "What about Mom?" Her question hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't thought much about Tracy lately, not beyond the necessary logistics of the divorce and the kids. She had become almost a ghost in my life, there, but not really. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "Your mom's going through a rough time too. But she loves you both, and she's doing her best." Kyle didn't say anything after that, just kept eating his ice cream, but I could tell he wasn't fully convinced. And honestly, neither was I. Tracy was trying, but the weight of her decisions was crushing her. The videos, the affair, the divorce, it all piled up until she was a shell of the person I used to know. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat down with a glass of whiskey, thinking about everything that had happened. I hadn't heard from Tracy in a few days, and I knew she was struggling. Part of me still felt anger toward her. How could I not? She had destroyed our marriage. But another part of me, buried deep down, couldn't help but feel pity. She had been played by Baranski and Greg just as much as I had. That night, I got a call from one of Tracy's friends. She was frantic. "Elliot, you need to check on Tracy. She's not answering anyone's calls, and I'm worried." I froze, my stomach tightening. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. She's been in a bad place ever since the videos leaked, and I think she might be hurting herself. Please just check on her." I hung up without saying anything, grabbing my keys and heading for the door. I didn't know what I was going to find, but I couldn't just sit there and ignore it. When I got to her apartment, I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. My heart pounded in my chest as I knocked harder, calling her name. "Tracy, open up." Nothing. I fumbled with my phone, ready to call 911, when I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind the door. A second later, it cracked open, and Tracy stood there, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she was shaking. "Elliot, she said, her voice barely audible. I pushed the door open gently, stepping inside. Tracy, what's going on? People are worried about you. She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. I've lost everything. Everyone hates me. I sat down across from her, unsure of what to say. I had every reason to hate her, to walk away and let her deal with the mess she'd made. But looking at her now, broken and alone, something inside me softened. You haven't lost everything, I said, my voice quieter than I expected. You still have the kids. And they need you. They're confused, Tracy. They're hurting. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with guilt and regret. I'm sorry, Elliot. For everything. I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I just wanted to feel something again. I stared at her, my emotions conflicted. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind her that she was the one who destroyed our family. But another part of me, the part that had loved her for years, just felt tired. I know, Tracy. But it's too late to change what happened. She nodded, wiping her tears. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know how to move on from this. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything hanging in the air between us. I knew I couldn't fix her, couldn't undo what had been done. But maybe, just maybe, I could help her find a way to move forward. You need to focus on the kids, I said finally. They're what matters now. You need to be there for them, even if it's hard. Tracy nodded again, a small glimmer of understanding in her eyes. I'll try, she whispered. As Tracy sat there, broken and lost, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I had every reason to hate her, to tell her that this was her mess to deal with. But instead, I found myself wanting to help her, if only for the sake of the kids. You can't keep spiraling like this, Tracy, I said softly. The kids need you to pull yourself together. They don't understand what's going on, and they're hurting. She wiped her face, nodding slowly. I know. I've made such a mess of everything. I sighed, leaning back. We both made mistakes, but the past is done. Now we have to figure out how to move forward. You need to be there for them, fully present, not drowning in guilt. Her eyes flickered with something like hope, but it was faint. I'll try. I want to be better. For them. It wasn't much, but it was a step. We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of everything still heavy between us, but something had shifted. I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive her, but I knew I had to let go of the anger for the kids' sake. The next few weeks were slow, but steady. Tracy started making more of an effort with Kyle and Emily, and I could see her trying to rebuild some kind of connection with them. It wasn't easy, they were still distant, unsure of how to navigate this new reality, but at least she was showing up. That was more than I could have asked for. Meanwhile, I focused on picking up the pieces of my own life. I threw myself into work, making sure the company I'd sold was running smoothly and staying far away from Baronski's shadow. I spent more time with the kids, taking them out on weekends, trying to give them a sense of normalcy. But even as things started to settle, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. The damage that had been done wouldn't just disappear. Baronski was gone, Greg had been dealt with, and Tracy was trying to patch up her life, but the wounds from all of it were still there. And yet, for the first time in months, I felt like I could see a way out of the wreckage. Maybe the road ahead wasn't as bleak as it had seemed. As the weeks went by, things slowly started to stabilize, but the hardest part was helping Kyle and Emily heal. They were still carrying the weight of everything that had happened, even if they didn't fully understand it. I tried to be there for them as much as possible, but I knew they needed more than just me to feel whole again. One Saturday morning, I sat Kyle down in the living room. He'd been quiet for days, and I knew he was bottling things up. At 13, he was old enough to know something serious had happened, but young enough to be confused about how to deal with it. You okay, buddy? I asked, sitting next to him on the couch. Kyle shrugged, not looking up from his phone. I don't know. It's weird. Everything's different now. I nodded, trying to find the right words. Yeah, it is. But we're going to get through this. I know things have been rough, but you and your sister are the most important thing to me. I'm always here if you need to talk, okay? He finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with uncertainty. Is Mom going to be okay? I hesitated, not wanting to lie to him. She's trying, Kyle. She's trying to get better, and she loves you and your sister. It's going to take time, but we'll figure it out." He didn't say much after that, but I could see a small bit of relief in his eyes. We didn't need to say much more. Sometimes just knowing someone's there is enough. Later that day, I took Emily out for lunch, just the two of us. At 10, she was struggling to understand why everything had changed. She kept asking me questions I wasn't always prepared for, but I tried my best to give her honest answers without overwhelming her. "Daddy, is Mom sad because of what happened with Greg?" she asked, out of the blue, as we were eating. I froze for a second, caught off guard by her bluntness. "Yes, sweetie, she is. She made some bad choices, and she's feeling bad about it now." Emily frowned, poking at her food. "I don't want her to be sad. I just want things to go back to how they were." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I know, Emily. I wish that too. But sometimes things change, and we have to find a new kind of normal. What matters is that you, Kyle, and I are still a family. We'll always be here for each other." She nodded, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. It wasn't an easy thing to understand, not at her age. But I promised myself I'd help her navigate it, one step at a time. In the weeks that followed, Tracy made a more noticeable effort with the kids. She started showing up on time for her weekends with them, taking them out to do things they enjoyed. I wasn't sure if she'd ever fully regain their trust, but I could see them warming up to her again, little by little. We weren't the family we once were. That was clear. But we were still a family, in our own way, and that had to be enough. With time, things started to feel more routine. It wasn't the same as before, nothing could be, but we were adjusting. The kids were slowly healing, even if the scars of the past were still there. They spent more time with Tracy, and though our interactions were limited, we kept things civil for their sake. But life didn't stop moving, and neither could I. One morning, while I was dropping Kyle and Emily off at school, Kyle suddenly turned to me. "Dad, are you ever going to date someone else?" I was caught off guard. It wasn't something I'd thought much about, not with everything that had happened. I focused so hard on keeping things together that I'd pushed the idea of moving on to the back of my mind. "I don't know, buddy. Maybe someday," I replied carefully. "Right now, I'm just focused on you and your sister." He nodded, seeming to accept that answer for now, but I could see the gears turning in his head. It made me realize that while I was putting all my energy into helping the kids, I hadn't thought much about what came next for me. A couple of weeks later, I decided to take some time for myself. It wasn't much, just an evening out with a few friends I hadn't seen in a while. We went to a small restaurant downtown, grabbed a few drinks, and caught up on life. For the first time in months, I felt a little bit like my old self again. One of my friends, Mark, nudged me as we were sitting at the bar. "You know, it's not too early to start thinking about dating again, right?" I laughed, shaking my head. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that, man. Too much baggage." Mark raised an eyebrow. "We all have baggage, Elliot. Doesn't mean you can't move forward. You've been through hell, but you're still standing. Don't let the past keep you stuck." I shrugged, not really committing to anything. The idea of dating again still felt strange, but Mark's words stuck with me. Maybe it was time to think about what came next, not just for the kids, but for me too. A few days later, I found myself at the park with Emily and Kyle. They were playing on the swings while I sat on a bench, watching them. I noticed a woman sitting nearby, also watching her kids. We exchanged a small smile, the kind strangers share when they're both caught in the same everyday routine. She looked over after a moment. "Your kids?" "Yeah," I said, nodding toward them. "They're mine." "Yours?" She smiled. "Yep, 2 little bundles of energy. I'm Sarah, by the way." I introduced myself, and we made small talk for a while, mostly about the kids and school stuff. It was easy, natural, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel weighed down by everything that had happened. It wasn't much, but it felt like the start of something, maybe not with her, but with the idea that there was life beyond the wreckage. After that day, I realized I wasn't as stuck as I thought I was. The storm that had ripped through my life was finally passing, and while I wasn't sure what came next, I knew I wasn't alone in figuring it out. After that brief conversation with Sarah at the park, something shifted in me. It wasn't about her specifically, but it was the first time I'd felt like there was life beyond the disaster I'd been living in. Maybe I could start rebuilding, not just for the kids, but for myself. I didn't rush into anything though. My focus was still on Kyle and Emily, making sure they were adjusting to the new normal. But I started thinking about the future in a way I hadn't before. One evening, while we were having dinner, Emily asked me, "Dad, do you miss being married?" I paused, caught off guard by the question. "Sometimes, yeah. But not to your mom, not anymore. It's different now, and that's okay." She looked thoughtful, like she was trying to understand. "Will you ever get married again?" I smiled softly. "Maybe. But right now, I'm happy with just us." Kyle, listening quietly, finally chimed in. "I think you'll meet someone new." "You should, Dad." Hearing that from him made me realize they were starting to heal too. They were accepting that things had changed and were okay with it, which gave me permission to think about what came next for myself. In the following weeks, I started getting out more, nothing serious, just meeting up with friends or taking time for myself. It felt good to step out of the role of dad cleaning up a mess and into Elliot, just living life again. One night, as I was lying in bed, I thought about everything I'd been through. The betrayal, the divorce, the chaos. It had taken so much from me, but it hadn't destroyed me. I was still standing, and that was something. I wasn't sure what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could face it without the weight of the past holding me down. As the days turned into months, life settled into a new rhythm. The chaos of the past felt further away, like a bad dream I was finally waking up from. Tracy was doing better, too. She was making an effort with the kids, showing up on time, and even trying to patch things up with her family. I didn't talk to her much beyond the essentials, but it felt less tense between us, like we'd both finally accepted our new roles. One afternoon, I got a call from her. At first, I thought it was about the kids, but her tone was different, softer, almost apologetic. "Elliot," she began, "I just wanted to say thank you. For being understanding. And for helping with the kids. I know I've put you through a lot." I didn't know how to respond right away. The anger I once felt had dulled over time, replaced by something more neutral. I wasn't ready to forgive her completely, but I wasn't holding on to the same bitterness either. "I appreciate that, Tracy," I said after a pause. "We're both just trying to do what's best for the kids." There was a silence on the line before she spoke again, her voice quieter. "I hope one day you can forgive me." I didn't give her an answer. Not because I was still angry, but because I wasn't sure if forgiveness was what mattered anymore. I had already moved on in my own way. That evening, I sat on the back porch, watching the sunset. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe, like the weight of everything that had happened was finally lifting. I thought about how far I'd come since the day I found out about the affair, and I realized something. I didn't need revenge, and I didn't need closure from Tracy. What I needed was to let go. The kids were happy, I was rebuilding my life, and the storm had passed. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was mine. And that was enough. The day I truly let go was the day I felt like I could start again. Not from scratch, but from a place of understanding that life doesn't always go the way you expect, and that's okay. The scars from what had happened would always be there, but they no longer defined me. I had moved forward. Tracy and I kept things civil for the kids, but I stopped worrying about how she was doing or what people thought about her. I'd accepted that she was part of my past, not my future. Our lives were separate now, and that was for the best. The kids were thriving. Kyle had found his passion in basketball, and I made it to every game. Emily started taking art classes, and I proudly displayed her drawings all over the house. Watching them grow, seeing them laugh again, it made everything worth it. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, Kyle looked up and said, "You seem happier now, Dad." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "I am, buddy. I really am." Emily, ever the curious one, leaned in. "Do you think you'll ever get married again?" I chuckled, thinking back to that same question from months ago. "Maybe someday, Emily. But right now, I'm just happy being with you too." They smiled, satisfied with my answer. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I realized I was content. I wasn't chasing after closure or revenge. I wasn't haunted by the past anymore. I was living in the present, and it was good. A few weeks later, I ran into Sarah again at the park. We talked a little longer this time, sharing stories about our kids and laughing over how exhausting parenting could be. It was easy, comfortable. As we said goodbye, she smiled and said, "Maybe we'll see each other here again." "Maybe we will," I replied, feeling a sense of possibility in those words. Life wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. I had my kids, my health, and my future ahead of me. And as I stood there, watching the sunset over the park, I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. One I was ready for.